55 seconds. 800 degrees. In the flames, in the smoke, in the silence that follows, Niki Lauda stopped being just a racing driver and became something far more haunting. A man caught between fear, pain, and the impossible pull to return. The doctors had already written him off. Ferrari had signed a replacement driver while he was in a coma, and a Catholic priest was reading him his last rites. 42 days later, Lauda was racing again. Before the victories, before the legend, there was this fire. The fire that would return in the final race and face Lauda one more time. But first, we begin here, where everything should have ended. By the time Formula One arrived at the German Grand Prix, the championship was alive. Lauda was leading the fight. Hunt was chasing hard. Ferrari had control. McLaren had momentum. Every weekend felt heavier now. Every mistake cost more. And the title fight came to the Nürburgring, the green hell. A track famous for punishing arrogance, misjudgment, and bad luck all at once. Lauda looked at it and saw danger. Not the romantic kind, the real kind. Before the race, he pushed for a boycott, not because courage failed him, because he was too intelligent to confuse courage with stupidity. The Nürburgring was over 14 miles of forest, elevation, blind corners and distance. Too long, too fast, too difficult to control if something went wrong. At the green hell, even danger moves. One section can be wet, another dry. One part visible, another buried in fog. Grip can disappear corner by corner. Too many places where help would arrive late. Too many places where late would mean death. The drivers voted. The race began. The track made its point. Lap 2. Lauda's Ferrari snapped out from under him, slammed into the barrier, burst into the flames, then bounced back into the path of oncoming cars. For a few seconds, it stopped being a crash and became a furnace. Merzario, Langer, Edwards, and Erdl were among the men who stopped and dragged him out. The helicopter did not appear instantly. It took minutes. And in a moment like that, minutes are enormous. His face and scalp were badly burned. His lungs were scorched by toxic fumes. He lost much of his right ear. At one stage, he was not expected to live. A priest was called to administer the last rites. Lauda was angry. He wasn't able to speak or move. But he was furious. Furious that the priest didn't even speak to him properly. Furious enough to decide he was not finished yet. That's the strange thing about survival. Sometimes it begins with hope. Sometimes it begins with irritation. Recovery was not cinematic. It was ugly, painful, clinical. His lungs had to be treated repeatedly. His wounds had to be cleaned. When Lauda woke, his hands had been tied to the bed, so he wouldn't touch his face and ruin the operation. Then came the mirror. A nurse finally took him to the sea himself. And this is where most people break. Not at the crash, not at the flames, at the reflection. Lauda talked to himself. If I look like this for the rest of my life, what are you going to do? And then the answer. Nothing. Nothing you can do. A fair deal. Being alive despite losing beauty. Accept it. Live. Most comeback stories would end there. He survived, fade out, roll credits. Not this one. Because while Lauda was still rebuilding his face, Ferrari was already rebuilding the team. Carlos Reutemann had been brought in. Enzo Ferrari was skeptical. The paddock was skeptical. And when Lauda turned up at the Fiorano, everyone who saw him had the same thought. He is like a ghost. Pale, scarred, unable to close his eyes, 10 kilos lighter, and absolutely determined to drive. At Monza, the comeback looked almost absurd. First came more medical checks, because apparently surviving the Nürburgring was still not enough paperwork. Then came fear, real fear. Lauda soon realized it was the most terrifying weekend in his whole life. At first, the pressure got to him. The car felt wrong. His mind felt wrong. Did the fire take his talent? Flames were taking over his mind again. But no, not this time. Night put out the fire. No noise, no times, no drama. just drive. On Saturday, he was the quickest Ferrari. On Sunday, just 42 days after the crash, he started 5th. And then he did something almost obscene in its defiance. He finished 4th, not symbolic 4th, not ceremonial 4th, a real 4th place in a Formula 1 race, while his burns were still raw under the helmet and his balaclava was soaked in blood by the end. This was not inspiration poster bravery. This was a champion forcing himself back into a machine before his body and his nightmares had fully caught up. And suddenly, the title fight was alive again. Hunt kept pushing. He won in Canada and United States. The championship was going all the way to the final race in Japan, the title decider. So now, the story had changed. It was no longer only about whether Lauda could return. It was about what kind of man returns from something like that. The same man or a different one pretending to be the same. Fuji gave the answer. The weather was atrocious. Rain hammered the circuit. Water sat on the track. Visibility collapsed. And for Lauda, this was not just ordinary wet weather danger. His eyelid injuries still affected his ability to blink normally. In those conditions, every spray cloud was worse. Every second was a gamble stacked on top of the gamble he had already survived. This time, Lauda understood the difference between courage and blindness. Niki Lauda drove into the pits and chose life over the championship. He said the line that turned the whole season inside out. My life is more important than a championship. And he retired from the race. Think about how brutal that is. Weeks earlier, the same man had come back from fire with reopened wounds, raced through pain, and put himself back in the title fight. Now with the world watching, he did the harder thing. He refused. He chose life in public. And in a sport built on obsession that almost looked like weakness. It wasn't. It was clarity. Lauda had already proved he would suffer for victory. He had already shown he would bleed for it. Winning matters. Of course it matters. But only a fool learns nothing from the age of a grave. And Lauda was never a fool. He was the competitor. James Hunt fought on, finished 3rd, and took the title by a single point. So on paper, Lauda lost. That is the statistic. That is what the record book says. But history is usually more intelligent than the record book. Because what Lauda lost at Fuji was the championship. What he kept was himself. And 1 year later, he came back and won the title anyway. Winning is one thing, but out of losing I always learned more. These words from Lauda himself might be the real ending to this story. Not the fire, not the scars, not even the comeback. The lesson. This is the story of Niki Lauda. Not just the man who knows how to win, but also the man who knows how to lose. In the end, only one question remains. If it's not about winning, then what is it all about? Sometimes, it's about knowing exactly when not to die for it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, like, comment, and subscribe for more.